Okay, so this is a well-known sikh on Likkutei Sichos, in Likkutei Sichos on Yutis Kislev, and Bechlal within Likkutei Sichos, within the Rebbe Torah in general, there are certain recurring sugyas, there are certain recurring themes that the Rebbe comes back to address a number of times, and each time the Rebbe addresses it from a different angle. And the subject of Yutis Kislev is like a sugya, not just a date. And the sugya, the concept of Yutis Kislev, of course, is associated with the concept, the sugya of what is Chassidus and what is Chassidus Chabad in particular, and what they're trying to achieve and how it's supposed to be engaged and so on. So you can kind of put together all the Sichos on Yutis Kislev, and you'll get a full picture of how the Rebbe thinks about Yutis Kislev, how the Rebbe thinks about Chassidus, and each time the Rebbe comes from like a different angle, and you can put them together. In particular, we're going to see in the Sikha that there are two ways to think about what Chassidus is trying to achieve, and these two ways itself is like at the core of the sugya of Yutis Kislev. So let's begin then. Mesupar, it is related. That when the Alter Rebbe was in prison, Bo Pamachas, he was once visited Levakar, they once came to visit him, Rabboisav, his teachers, Me'alma Tikshoit, from the world of truth. His teachers were Rabbi, his direct teacher, his direct Rebbe, Harav Magid, the Magid of Mizrich, Vabal Shem Tov, Shmos Eden, and the Baal Shem Tov. Stam, I once heard a Sikha Rebbe spoke about this story, that the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid came to visit the Alter Rebbe. If I remember the story, details of the story correctly, it was the Rebbe Rashab who instructed the Frierdiker Rebbe who was visiting the prison to go see how big the cells are, to see if there's enough place for 3 people. Meaning to say that the assumption of the Rabbi was that the story is literally that they came, not just a vision, but they actually literally came to the point that the Rebbe, I think it was the Rebbe Rashab asking the Frierdiker Rebbe, he wants to know, the Rebbe related the story, he wanted to know if there's enough place for 3 people. Okay, so in jail, of course, their Maggid and the Baal Shem Tov had passed away many years earlier, and they come to visit the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe asks of them, why is it that he's sitting in jail? What do they want from him? He's not asking for a rundown of the government, what's the word? The accusations, the indictment. He's asking on a spiritual level. What did he deserve to be sitting in jail? And they responded to him. There was a great accusation being made against him concerning the fact that he's relating Chassidus in plenty and in open. So the Alter Rebbe asks of them, the Maggid and the Baal Shem Tov, and when I get out of here, should I then stop saying Chassidus because I'm being accused here in heaven of teaching too much Chassidus and maybe I should stop? And they responded to him, al tafsik, because you started teaching Chassidus, don't stop. On the contrary, when you go out, you should be teaching Chassidus even more. This is the basic outline of the story. So there are comments. Kolemar means to say, the arrest of the Alter Rebbe down here physically, nishtalshal, is really derived from the fact, uba, and comes from a spiritual decree against him. Accusation against the fact that he's teaching too much Chassidus, that he's saying lots of Chassidus and he's saying it openly in public. Therefore, and therefore the Alter Rebbe was therefore in doubt. Maybe he has to stop this conduct. If in heaven they're telling him they're putting him in jail for teaching too much Chassidus, then maybe he should stop. Maybe in Shemaim they don't want him to. And of this, his teachers instructed him, on the contrary, when you go out of jail, you should teach even more. Okay, this is a basic story, and I think most of us are aware of this idea. This seems to require some explanation. This kind of accusation in Shemayim already happened once before, during the time when the Maggid of Mizrich was Rebbe, while he was still alive. As is well known the story, it is a kidrig oz about the decree in heaven against him, the sibasa and its reason. Namely, Shapam, there was one time, Matzu kav shel CHASSIDUS, ksav shel CHASSIDUS, shizgalzel b'mokem bilti roi. They found a ksav, a handwritten note of CHASSIDUS that was rolling around in an inappropriate place. Right, this is before the printing press, or at least not the ubiquitous printing. And lots of CHASSIDUS is, print is expensive and rare, and CHASSIDUS is mostly passed by manuscript. One person copies from another. So one such manuscript is found rolling in the mud. And this was at the time when the Pinchas Koretz, who was a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov and friend of the Maggid, Talmud Chaver, like a friend student of the Maggid, and therefore he was able to respond. And he in general was very particular about Chassidus and the secrets of Torah in general being treated with the appropriate decorum. And the Alter Rebbe knew that Pinchas Koretz seeing manuscript of Chassidus rolling in an inappropriate place, that he would be very difficult for him to handle. And therefore, Pinchas Koretz's opposition to this idea itself elicited a decree in heaven against the fact that there's Chassidus rolling in the street, rolling in the mud. So continues the story. If you look in the footnote 4, it gives two different sources for the story. If you go to the letter to the Frierdiker Rebbe, there's two sources there, Hatam and the letter, and the letter is very beautifully elaborated. So that's a kitr l'maylo, therefore there was a decree above in heaven. Alamagid on the Magid farsim in Yoni Rosen, that he's publicizing matters of the secrets of Torah, but even the Tish Bachena. It's a quote from Pasuk in Eicha, where there it describes that the treasures of Yerushalayim, the treasures of the temple, are rolling on the street. So here too, the treasures of Hashem, the secrets of Torah, are rolling on the street. The holy stones are rolling in every street corner, is rolling on the floors. These holy stones. I said, Pasuk in Eicha laments the destruction of Yerushalayim. So likewise, with the secrets of Torah rolling on the street. This was a Pinchas Koretz's problem, and this elicited a decree in heaven. Now, Rabbi is talking bitlak, it's like a trick. The Alter Rebbe, present at the time, defended the Maggid's position, and in this way nullified the decree in heaven. Al-Shevi Mashal, he gave the example, the famous example, Ben Melech, from the prince, became sick with a very dangerous sickness. They could only find one solution to the sickness. This part of the story, the Frierdiker Rebbe in that letter elaborates, explains it, dramatizes it. It's very beautiful. So they only found one cure for this kid's sickness, for the prince's sickness. What do they have to do? The Frierdiker Rebbe says the same story a few times, and each time it's said a little differently. There's two sources there. There's Hatam and there's a letter. So if you look at the letter, it's a little bit more elaborate, if I remember correctly. So what's the solution for this prince? Says the Alter Rebbe as a way by way of analogy. To take the precious stone that's there situated in the center of the king's crown, in which is dependent all the beauty of the king's crown. This is the centerpiece of the king's crown. Is this stone? To grind it up and to mix it with water, and to hopefully to pour a little bit of that the stone ground up mixed with water, to pour a little bit into the lips of the prince. Betikva, with the hope, that perhaps maybe a little bit of this mixture, this solution will fall into his mouth, the tatzel chayev, and this will save the prince's life. The Frierdiker elaborates in the other source how they're trying to find the cure and they couldn't find one until finally they told the king that he has to give that to find the jewel, and they found the jewel and they ground it up and they put it into water, and then they come to tell the king that the situation of the prince has gotten worse. He can't even open his mouth, he can't even swallow, but maybe if we pour it, then most of it's going to spill on the side. If a little bit goes into his mouth, maybe hopefully it's not even a guarantee, maybe he'll revive. And the king readily agrees. If this is the only chance of his son being saved, so be it. Destroy the jewel, let it jewel all over the floor. What's the difference? As long as there's a possibility that maybe his son will be saved. And therefore, said the Alter Rebbe, the same thing is true here. If you look at the Chassidus chat, there's the PDF with the text. I don't know if Jordan has it. You have it? Okay. So Shekenu Gam Ben Dan. The same thing is true in our situation. Asher Pearson Razi Atayda, the Pearson, the publicizing, thank you, of the secrets of Torah, which is the precious jewel of the king's crown, God's crown, Ben HaMelech, Am Yisrael. It's worthwhile to let the words of Chassidus end up rolling on the streets if a little bit is going to go into the Jewish people, which is the God's prince, and revive them. Okay, so this is the basic idea that the Alter Rebbe explained. And it's elaborated elsewhere in the Sichos. The Rebbe addresses the story, the details of the story, what the meaning of the details of the story. But the basic idea we get, the Jewish people, as we know, were in a state of faint before the Baal Shem Tov came along. And the history of that is not for now, but the Jewish people were in a very depressed state, both spiritually, materially, socioeconomically, structurally. The old Jewish Kehillah was coming apart. The Jewish people suffered then pogroms a little while earlier. They were still dealing with the aftermath of the debacle of the false Messiah and the aftermath. So the Jewish people were in a state of faint, and the Baal Shem Tov came along and taught these Chassidish ideas of Avos Yisrael, of the Neshama, of the purity of the Neshama, and in this way revived the Jewish people.
This is the early 1800s? No.
Or mid 1700s.
Okay.
Mid 1700s. The early 1800s, Alter Rebbe is the Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe passes away in 1812.
Late 1700s.
Yes, the Alter Rebbe passes away in 1812. Baal Shem Tov is before then, is a bit, maybe even mid 1700s, or maybe even early 1700s. I don't remember the exact dates, but definitely the Alter Rebbe definitely died and passed away in 1812. At any rate, so this is the analogy that the Alter Rebbe gives to justify why there are Chassidus rolling in an inappropriate place. Because if we want to get a little bit of it into the Jewish people's mouth, that a little bit goes into their mind and hearts and the souls, that they wake them up and revive them as the prince is suffering, the king's prince is suffering, it's worthwhile to grind up the crown jewel of the king, the Chassidus, the secrets of Torah, even if it means some of it's going to end up in the bud, as long as a little bit goes into the Jewish people and the Jews can be revived. This is what the Alter Rebbe said. So continues the Rebbe now, based on this, if the Alter Rebbe himself defended the popularization of Chassidus, the revelation of Chassidus, and defended it against the accusing problem in heaven, by explaining that publicizing Chassidus is a necessary matter. It's a question of saving lives, which is required to save the life of the prince, the Jewish people. How much more so? If another generation of the descent of the Jewish people has come, so by the time Baal Shem Tov passes away, and the Maggid passes away, and the Alter Rebbe is now here, so certainly the Jewish people are in a lower state than they were before. And therefore we can assume the prince, the Jewish people's spiritual state is deteriorated. Certainly. Spreading the words of Chassidus, which is in the analogy, grinding up the precious jewel in the king's crown, is absolutely necessary for saving the life of the prince of the Jewish people. So Manishtana, what changed? At the time of the leadership of the Alter Rebbe, that again, now there's another accusation in heaven against him that he's teaching Chassidus and revealing Chassidus. Right? If you already defended it once, why is it coming against him again? To the point that the decree was so problematic that the Alter Rebbe himself was in doubt. Even though he himself was the one who defended the Maggid by introducing this analogy of the precious stone being ground up to save the prince. So he himself brought that analogy. And therefore, when the Maggid, the Baal Shem Tov, tell him that there's a decree against him in heaven, why isn't he just pulling out that analogy again? But for some reason, he doesn't. And there's a new accusation to the point that he's in doubt. That perhaps he should stop teaching Chassidus. And it required, and it's explicit instruction from his teachers. On the contrary, when you go out of jail, you should save him more. Okay, this is a question that the Rebbe addresses in more than one Sicha, which basically gets to what's the difference between Chassidus in general and Chabad Chassidus in particular. Right? Chassidus in general begins with the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. So that's one accusation. And for that accusation, it suffices the Alter Rebbe's analogy of grinding up the stone of the king to save the child. But then a new accusation arrives when the Alter Rebbe teaches Chassidus. So there must be something unique about the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus CHABAD, that invites a new accusation in heaven. This is essentially what the story is indicating to us by the fact that the Alter Rebbe defends the Maggid, but can't defend himself with the same analogy. So for whatever reason, the teaching of Chabad Chassidus fails us. Sorry, when it comes to the teaching of Chabad Chassidus, the analogy fails us. So we're moving beyond, yeah?
Seemingly it's a different kitter also.
So what is the new kitter? That's the question. Yeah. So we're moving beyond, we already see here now that the Rebbe is moving beyond Chassidus simply as an antidote to a depressed people. Because if it was simply an antidote to a depressed people, then the analogy that he presented to defend the Maggid would have been enough. That's the analogy. The analogy is there's a depressed people that require some uplifting, require inspiration. Okay, so we're going to even give them Chassidus. It ends up in the wrong places. Okay, but it's worth it. That analogy didn't suffice to explain why the Alter Rebbe is teaching Chabad Chassidus, which means Chabad Chassidus goes beyond just solving the problem of a person lacking inspiration. There's something more to it. That's what the story indicates. Yeah, which leads into a certain way of thinking of the Rebbe's about learning Chassidus, which I'm going to foreshadow now. And with Hashem's help, tomorrow, if we finish the Sicha, I want to show you a little passage from another Sicha in which the Rebbe makes this point very clearly, which is this idea of learning Chassidus b'shufi. Learning Chassidus, shufi means a lot, in abundance, as opposed to the way Chassidus was often learned in previous generations, where it's all about the avodah. It's all about the work, the internal work. So what do you mean just learn abundance of Chassidus? Take one mimer, and until you've integrated it, don't go to the next mimer. I'm exaggerating, obviously. That wasn't the exact approach, but there was that idea that unless you've integrated the teaching completely, what are you going to the next teaching for? Yeah. And the Rebbe advocated not to replace the first type of Chassidus learning, which is to internalize and change the person, but the Rebbe also advocated for just the learning of the abundance of Chassidus, just in mass, just learning tons of Chassidus. Just learning next, learning more and more, just to know a lot.
Girsa
in the language of Nigla.
Not everyone is capable of firstly.
Okay, we'll see. Something like that maybe. So in this Sikha, that was going to allude to this idea, right? Because to save the person, the Maggid Chassidus is enough. But there's a new kitrug on the Alter Rebbe, which is beyond just saving the person from his issues. Right? It's not just enough to the analogy, the prince suffering is not enough, because it's more than just saving the depressed fellow. So let's see what this is all about. Beis, the Yuvan to Behektim will understand this by first prefacing Bir Divrei Hardizal, by first explaining the words of the Hardizal, famous words of the Hardizal that Chassidus quotes, the Alter Rebbe quotes, share that, quote, Dafke B'Doros Elu, specifically in these generations, Achreinim, these latter generations, Mutter, it's permitted, Mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah, to reveal this wisdom, the wisdom of Kabbalah, the wisdom of the inner dimension of Torah. That's the quote. It's permitted and a mitzvah to reveal this teaching, the teachings of Kabbalah, teachings of Pneumius HaTorah, the inner dimension of Torah. Even though in previous generations, the status of Kabbalah was nistira, concealed, hidden, and concealed from all these all the scholars of Torah, except for unique individuals, and even to these unique individuals, in a very discreet manner, Kabbalah, mysticism was not taught in public. The Gemara says, the Gemara gives a bunch of restrictions about how the inner dimension of Torah is to be taught. How many people should be listening, and what the person's preparation should be before they start learning Chassidus. It's not just, Chassidus classes for anybody. Wednesday night Kabbalah for everybody off the street, and you advertise in the newspaper. That the Gemara says not to do that. And yet, comes the Arizal and says, especially the way Chassidus quotes it, that nowadays it's a mitzvah to reveal these teachings of Chassidus. So the Rebbe asked, L'chora, seemingly, Mekim Chayru Chazal Shedvarim, Shein Kivshoyne Shalom, Sisra Shalom, Yutachas Levoshecha. The Gemara instructs that matters that stand at the height of the world, This mysticism should be concealed under your garment, means it should be concealed. Gemara, and according to the halacha, as the Gemara lays it out, there's a number of conditions, vagbalas and limitations, in the manner in which this wisdom is revealed. And the Rambam in his halachas of Hilchas Yisei Torah, where discusses observing nature and thinking about the Hashem and his greatness in terms of loving Hashem, he rules that a person should limit his learning in those realms. So how could it then become permitted in later generations, not just as permission, but actually a mitzvah to reveal this wisdom? It's against halacha. Halacha is halacha. Halacha says you have to conceal these wisdom, and only certain people are allowed to learn the wisdom of mysticism, and only with certain conditions. And then comes along the Ardizal, especially as CHASSIDUS says it, and says, no, everybody's got to learn it. So how does this work? We're undoing a halacha. The explanation of Behektim by first prefacing. Movement is understood. The conditions placed and the limitations placed on the learning of the true wisdom. This is the way Kabbalah is referred to, Chachmas Emes, the wisdom of truth. Not true wisdom, the wisdom of truth. It's not forbidden because there's something wrong with mysticism itself. Right? Sometimes in halacha you have these two ways of looking at various different prohibitions. Is the problem with the object or is the problem with the person? The person shouldn't engage in that. Or the object itself is off limits. So when it comes to Kabbalah, we cannot say that the prohibition and the limitations around learning Kabbalah is because there's something inherently wrong with the object of learning of that subject. That can't be the case. That somehow this part of Torah has to inherently be concealed. It is Torah, it is perfect, it is pure, it is beautiful. So it cannot be, even from a halachic perspective, that the prohibition against learning mysticism publicly, or the limitations on who's allowed to learn it and how to learn it, is not because there's something inherently wrong with that part of Torah, God forbid. Obviously, it's a problem with the person. Because most people are incapable of fully grasping these ideas. They're mystical, they're abstract. And therefore, if a person doesn't learn these ideas properly, it can cause more harm than good. Similar to that which the Gemara says about Torah in general. The Gemara says in Yuma about Torah in general that if a person merits, then Torah becomes a potion of life. If a person doesn't merit, Torah itself becomes a potion of, never doesn't spell it out, but the Gemara says death. Becomes poison if a person doesn't merit. So if Torah in general, learned in some way where it lacks merit, it could become a potion of death, God forbid. How much more so these sensitive, mystical ideas can become a potion of death for the person who's incapable of properly learning it. But as far as the object of that subject goes, the object of Torah itself, this wisdom, the mysticism, is a part of Torah, which is associated with each person. Torah is inherited to each individual. The fact that Torah is referred to as an inheritance means that it's unlimited, right? Because when it comes to acquiring something, the quickest and easiest way to acquire something is by inheritance. Even a baby who's completely unconscious and unaware of the inheritance inherits everything automatically. So when Torah is referred to as an inheritance, it means all of Torah belongs to you, even if you can't access it, because you're too immature to access it. It doesn't change the fact that you can access it. It belongs to you. So therefore, every part of Torah, including mysticism, is inherited to each and every individual. And therefore, every single Jew is obligated to learn it. Just like every individual is obligated to learn every part of Torah. Okay, the limitations are only because I'm not there yet. I don't know how to handle it. I don't understand it so well.
So this is saying the times of the Gemara was on Chefza.
It was always on Gavra. Everything it was always on Gavra. It was never an issue of the Chefza. It was never an issue with the object of the subject of learning Kabbalah. It can't be. Kabbalah is part of Torah. It's just a problem with people. People can't handle it. So the limitations are all because to vet out those who are not able to handle it. That's the limitations. So only a few people at a time. So you know who you're talking to. Make sure the person has a background in halacha. Make sure the person has a certain sensitivity to spirituality, etc., etc. So as long as the conditions are met, where the person is capable of handling it, teach him. But inherently, all of Torah belongs to every person, including Kabbalah belongs to every person. Continuing, especially if we take into consideration the words of Rambam, at the end of his book of halacha, and here we're going to quote the Rambam at the end of the laws of And then the book of laws, period, which is the laws of Mashiach. But there he writes, why says man, at that time when Mashiach comes, the world's occupation will be nothing other than the knowledge of God alone. Therefore, and therefore Jewish people will be great scholars, knowing hidden matters, knowing Kabbalah. That's what we're going to be knowing. We will know the knowledge of God. This is mysticism. This is Kabbalah. To the best the person is capable. As the verse says, the world will be filled with knowledge of God as the ocean covers, as the water covers the seabed. So we see clearly from this halacha in Rambam that when Mashiach comes, the world's occupation will be nothing other than the knowledge of God. This means to say, the primary occupation of Torah study at the time will be, it's not going to be merely the halachas, which everybody knows anyway. Because the Rambam stresses we're going to be knowing hidden matters. Ella, rather, what are we going to be occupied with? Knowing the Creator. Which are hidden matters. And this is going to be what the entire world is occupied with. In such a way that it's ubiquitous, like the water covers the seabed. So move on. So it's clear. Obviously, when Mashiach comes, the limitations imposed on learning Kabbalah that only goes to one person, and even that one person should have background and so on and so forth, those limitations are off. Because when Mashiach comes, Rambam rules, everybody's going to be learning Kabbalah, basically. Seemingly, is this not opposite to the Rambam's ruling itself? Concerning the conditions and the limitations around learning this wisdom. When Mashiach comes, no halacha is erased. So if the halacha still stands, that there are limitations on learning Kabbalah, why then when Mashiach comes, we're learning Kabbalah? It's against halacha. In other words, Rebbe is saying the question is not only on us, who we rule like the Arizal, which says to learn Kabbalah. So the question becomes, how are we ignoring the limitations? Rebbe is saying you put that aside. The halacha itself says, as per Rambam, that when Mashiach comes, we're going to be learning Kabbalah. Okay, is halacha off the table when Mashiach comes? Halacha still stands. So if halacha imposes limitations on learning Kabbalah, how can we learn Kabbalah when Mashiach comes? Therefore, we must say, the entire prohibition to begin with. The prohibition is not because there's something wrong with Kabbalah itself, God forbid, but because people can't handle it. Therefore, Torah puts on certain conditions around learning Kabbalah to make sure the person is capable. But when Mashiach comes, where there's not going to be any hunger, no war, no jealousy, and no strife. So every single person will be at the level where he's capable of indulging in the study of Kabbalah. And if when Mashiach comes, that's all we're going to be doing. So the limitations are not going to be necessary. And the fact that the limitations aren't necessary is not against the halacha. That is the halacha. The halacha is those who are incapable shouldn't learn Kabbalah. Good. Mashiach came, you're now capable, go learn Kabbalah. And therefore, the same thing is true of the generation preceding Mashiach. And therefore, in the latter generations, mitzvah legalis zeisachachma. It's a mitzvah to reveal this wisdom of Kabbalah, notwithstanding the limitations and the conditions that are placed upon by the halacha, because now it's required. But why? Okay, why? So when Mashiach comes, it's going to be allowed, the limitations are gone, because everybody's going to be at the level where they're able to learn Kabbalah. Can we say that now too? That we're now at all the level where we're capable of learning Kabbalah. So the generations of the Tanoim and the Amoraim, when the Gemara was standing, they were not capable of learning Kabbalah. But you and I, yeah, we're capable. That doesn't sound right. So then what is it about our generations that makes us lift the conditions and limitations of learning Kabbalah? And therefore, we can give two explanations, which basically is two explanations for why Chassidus has become revealed and why it's necessary in our generation. These two explanations is at the core of all or many of the Rebbe's talks on Yitas Kislev. The sugya of Yitas Kislev I mentioned before, which is the sugya of understanding what Chassidus is all about. These two explanations as to why in our times it's necessary to reveal Kabbalah becomes at the centerpiece of the Rebbe's discussions on Yitzhak Kislev. Do we stop here? How much time are we supposed to stop before Shachris?
So finish.
Finish? Okay. Okay. So we might suggest two explanations. Number one, the reason for revealing Chassidus now is similar to the Rambam's introduction to his Guide to the Perplexed, where there he explains why he's writing the Guide to the Perplexed. It's a very sharp introduction, where there the Rambam writes basically that for a long time he wanted to write this book, which explains, puts Torah into a philosophical language, so that the student of Aristotle, which was very popular in the Rambam's region at the time, should be able to respond, to know how to understand Torah within that context of that world. But he didn't want to write it, he said, because he was very afraid that people would misunderstand it. He writes, either the person reading it is himself going to become a heretic, or he's going to think I'm a heretic. And either way, I don't want that to happen. Until he says that he found a certain student who needs this book, so good, I'm going to write it for him. That's what he writes. And he explains, that the reason why he writes this book of the Guide to the Perplexed, in which there are concealed, hidden, deep philosophical ideas, who is because Amram, our sages have said, in a similar context, in a similar context, the Pasuk says, it's a time to act for God. The literal translation is, it's a time to act for God, for they have destroyed your Torah. They destroyed your Torah, so you got to act for Hashem. The Gemara reads it the other way around. You may have to destroy your Torah because it's time to do for God. The Gemara uses this with respect to why the Mishnah is written down. The Mishnah is Torah Shebal Peh, is the oral law, and halacha is Dvarim Shebal Peh, matters that the Torah that Hashem gives orally, one is prohibited from writing down. This is what the halacha is. And yet we write down the Mishnah. Why? Explains the Gemara. Because we got to act for Hashem. So we may have to ignore one law in Torah, which is don't write down the oral law in order to save Torah itself. Because the generations are not going to be able to. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sees that exile is inevitable. And once the Jews are thrown out of Eretz Yisrael, it's going to be impossible to keep all of halacha by tradition only. So he's got to write down the Mishnah. So therefore, Rambam says, same thing with me. Namely, the Yois B'nai Yisrael, he sees people are perplexed because they're busy reading Aristotelian and Greek philosophy, and they're going to get things wrong in Torah. So that compelled him to reveal these hidden matters, which are going to resolve the issues that this philosophical student is dealing with, in order to save this perplexed student from matters of faith. Similarly, the same thing can be said of revealing the inner dimensions of Torah with respect to the later generations. It's within this realm of we have to act for Hashem, even if it means we have to ignore a little part of Torah. The great descent, the great downfall of the latter generations, our hearts have become smaller. We're less sensitive. We're less spiritually attached. This is the people. Is likewise, and generally the world out there is a very materialistic world. The negativity, the materialism, the hedonism of later generations, is overwhelming. So this creates a necessity, a great necessity, to reveal this wisdom, the inner dimension of Torah, as an antidote, which awaken the inner strength, the concealed strength within the soul of the person, which gives him help and gives him assistance, to overcome the darkness of exile that exists around us, and the inner turmoil that prevents us, to awaken in love of God and fear of God, to serve God wholeheartedly. Okay, so explanation number one. Number two, we'll address tomorrow. But explanation number one is the generations are suffering. We're dealing with lots of materialism. The world out there is a big, scary, overwhelming world. And therefore, the person, in order to serve Hashem properly, needs a boost. And therefore, even though the halacha says we have to limit the study of Kabbalah because most people aren't going to understand it, that's still true. Most people won't understand it. But we still need to. We have to. Because otherwise, the generation is going to suffer. No. This explanation parallels directly with the story that the Alter Rebbe gave, right? The story that the Alter Rebbe gave of the prince who's sick, and you got to grind up the precious jewel, and hopefully a little bit goes into the prince. This lines up right here. The generations are down. You got to save them. So we got to teach Chassidus, even if it means most people aren't going to understand it, or maybe most people will misunderstand it. Still worth it because you got to revive the people. Which means this explanation only works for the Maggid, not for the Alter Rebbe, right? Because as we said earlier, the Alter Rebbe is the one that defended the Maggid, and yet there was a decree against him again. Which means whatever explanation is offered to defend the Maggid for teaching Chassidus is not going to work for the Alter Rebbe. So if this is the reason to reveal Chassidus, because there's a depressed people who need inspiration, that's not enough to explain why the Alter Rebbe has to teach Chabad Chassidus. Just like we had the problem with the story. So if we have to come to the second explanation, which we'll look at tomorrow, why Chassidus is revealed in these generations. And that second explanation gives us the explanation for why the Alter Rebbe teach Chassidus. And as we'll see at the end, it's going to give us a unique approach of how the Rebbe teaches us to learn Chassidus, which we alluded to earlier, learning Chassidus b'shufi, learning Chassidus in abundance, and not just a little bit, not beyond just inspiring myself, because I'm dealing with all kinds of overwhelming stuff in the world. Beyond that, there's an importance to learning Chassidus, and that we'll explore, God willing, tomorrow. Have a good day, Yidden.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.